On the 20th of December 1987, passengers on board the motor vessel Doña Paz awoke with a start as the ship ground to a sudden, jarring halt. It was late at night after a long day of travel. As they stumbled from their cabins, the lights all over the ship went abruptly dark. There were screams, running footsteps, chaos in the corridors, and suddenly the glow of flames. Mere minutes ago, thousands of passengers had been talking, wandering the decks, sleeping. Now, suddenly, they were facing a life-or-death emergency, a disaster the sheer scale of which would see it later referred to as Asia's Titanic. The ship that would one day become the Doña Paz was built in 1963 in a shipyard in Hiroshima, Japan, and was initially named the Himeyuri Maru. She was a passenger ferry with a capacity of around 600 persons and operated for 12 years in the waters around Japan without any major incident. In 1975, the vessel was sold to the Philippine ferry operator Sulpicio Lines, which renamed her the Don Sulpicio. The ferry's capacity was increased to approximately 1,500, more than twice what it had been under its previous owners. Up until this point, the ferry had enjoyed an unblemished record, but during her time with her new operator, a more troubled period began. In 1979, during a routine trip from Manila to Cebu, a fire broke out on board. The passengers and crew evacuated swiftly, and there were no fatalities, although the ship was almost completely gutted by flames. The wreckage was towed back to port. Another ferry operator might have treated the ruined ship as a write-off, but Sulpicio Lines invested in buying back the wreck from its insurers, then rebuilding and relaunching the vessel. What had first been the Himeyuri Maru and then the Don Sulpicio was finally renamed the Doña Paz. This newly reconstructed ship was put to work, sailing a route between Manila and Tacloban, with a brief stop in Catbalogan twice a week for the next few years. On the 20th of December 1987, the Doña Paz departed Tacloban at 6:30 a.m. for a routine sailing. The journey should have lasted approximately one full day, with the ferry arriving in Manila at 4 a.m. the following morning. The sea was clear with some mildly choppy waves, conditions that the crew had encountered hundreds, if not thousands, of times before. As evening approached, one apprentice crewman was left on watch, while the others, the captain included, relaxed in their cabins. They watched television, chatted, slept, and drank beers. Survivors later reported that they had heard the sounds of upbeat music and lively chatter from the crew recreation area. It was a perfectly ordinary sailing until 10:40 p.m, when with no warning and no attempt at evasive maneuvers, another ship smashed into the side of the Doña Paz. This other ship was an oil tanker named the MT Vector, which was carrying around 1 million litres or 264,000 gallons of petroleum products. The effect of the crash was immediate. The Vector's hull ruptured, causing a massive fuel leak that covered the surrounding water in a layer of gasoline. A moment later, a huge explosion took place, and both vessels began to burn. On board the Doña Paz, chaos ensued. The crew were unprepared for a disaster of this magnitude. They made no attempt to organize or evacuate passengers, while the passengers themselves struggled to find emergency equipment. Life jackets were secured inside locked cupboards, which the crew did not open. The crew also did not launch any of the life rafts that were stacked on the upper decks. As smoke and flames spread throughout the ship, many passengers took the only route to salvation they could see. They leapt from the Doña Paz into the water of the Tablas Strait, using luggage or pieces of furniture as makeshift flotation aids. While this allowed them to escape the burning ship, it did not save them from the flames. The petroleum that had spilled into the water was now alight and burning fiercely, surrounding the damaged ships with a pool of blazing petrol. Remaining on board the ship meant burning to death or dying from smoke inhalation. Jumping into the water meant risking drowning or being covered in burning petrol. And even those who managed to avoid the slicks of blazing fuel and stay afloat in the choppy waters would have been aware that the Tablas Strait is home to a population of sharks. Add to this the intense confusion on board the Doña Paz as the lights went out and the crew failed to organize an evacuation, and most passengers on board stood little chance of survival. The Doña Paz burned completely and sank within 2 hours. The Vector sank within 4. A nearby ship, the MV Don Claudio, saw the blaze of light that accompanied the initial explosion and the fiery glow on the horizon that followed. Guessing that an accident had taken place, its crew steered towards the glow until they were close enough to pluck 25 survivors from the water, many of them with serious injuries that included burns and smoke inhalation. They were treated by medical staff on board the Don Claudio and transported urgently back to shore. These were the only survivors. They were 23 passengers from the Doña Paz and 2 crew members from the Vector. Though a search and rescue operation was carried out by the Philippine Coast Guard the next day, it found no other survivors, only a sea of charred bodies. The vast majority of the people that had been on board either of the 2 ships were now dead. Initially, it was thought that this should indicate a death toll of around 1,500. That was the capacity of the Doña Paz, and the Vector had had just 13 crew on board. However, as dozens, then hundreds of people reported their loved ones as missing, it became clear that the death toll was much higher. The Doña Paz, it transpired, had been grossly overloaded. At the time of the accident, the end-of-year holiday season had been approaching, and many travellers were keen to get home. It was perfectly routine at the time for ferries to be loaded beyond capacity. Even once all advance tickets had been sold, passengers would still be allowed to pay for travel and board the ferry. Children and members of the military were permitted free travel and were not recorded on the manifest. Taking into account these extra passengers, it appeared that the Doña Paz had been carrying thousands more passengers than it ought to. These extra passengers had slept on the floors of cabins, in corridors, in cots, and on decks. They had not been listed on the manifest, and they had been entirely in excess of the capacity of the ship. Because of the unofficial channels through which these passengers had secured their transit, it was difficult to make a full account of the dead. However, most estimates agree that the sinking of the Doña Paz cost not just 1,500 lives, but around 4,300. It was a death toll worse than anyone had ever imagined. An investigation by the Philippine Coast Guard followed, seeking to establish what had caused the collision in the first place. The conduct of the Sulpicio Line's crew was criticized by survivors, but it was ultimately found that the crew of the Vector had been mostly responsible for the accident. The Vector had no lookout, had been operating without a license, and was under the command of a captain who was not properly qualified. For these reasons, Sulpicio Lines was not found criminally responsible. Nonetheless, the company stated that it would distribute the insurance money it received after the accident to the families of survivors. Given the sheer number of casualties, however, this meant that many families received only around 20,000 Philippine pesos, or the equivalent of around $680. Several families pursued civil suits against Sulpicio Lines for further compensation. A memorial to those who lost their lives in this disaster stood for many years in a park in Catbalogan. In 2025, it was accidentally demolished during construction work for a new pizza restaurant, the owners of which subsequently pledged to restore a memorial of some kind. Overcrowding on ferries in the Philippines remains an issue to this day. While the Coast Guard carries out monitoring and enforcement against larger operators, Many travellers report that ferries are still often overcrowded to well beyond their capacity. In a nation with more than 7,000 islands, ferries are an essential means of travel, vital for the economy and for the lives of everyday citizens. The demand for ferry travel will always outstrip supply, creating a situation where overselling and overcrowding are always potentially possible, despite the ongoing work of the Coast Guard. The sinking of the Doña Paz, which claimed around 4,300 lives, remains the worst peacetime maritime disaster in history.